The morning it all still felt whole. I was standing at my kitchen counter in Winterset, dividing a coffee cake into 9 squares. 9 was the number of people I expected on my porch by 10, and I have never once in my life been able to cut anything except by eye. The cinnamon streusel had cracked along the top the way it always did. The east window let in that early light, and it fell across the butter dish and the old sunbeam mixer my mother left me. Somewhere on the counter, my phone was playing the farm report I keep on low out of habit. The announcer reading hog futures in that flat, reassuring Iowa cadence I have loved since I was a girl. My son Marcus was driving down from Ames with his 2, and my daughter Bernadette had said she might bring the grandchildren by after the Methodist service. I remember thinking, with the plain and undefended contentment of a woman who has no idea what is coming, that I was a lucky person. I was 51 that spring. My husband had been gone 4 years, the kids had been launched and landed, and I had rebuilt a life out of the pieces, the way you patch a quilt, 1 square at a time, until the thing is warm again. I set the cake near the window to cool, and I believed, the way you believe in the floor under your feet, that the people I loved would keep on loving me back. I should tell you who I was in those days, because it matters to everything that came after. A woman is more than the wound somebody hands her. I had 2 lives, really, braided together. 4 days a week, I worked as a hospice social worker out of an office in Des Moines, sitting with the dying and the ones who would soon be doing the harder work of surviving them. 20 years of that teaches you things. It teaches you how to be still in a room full of grief, how to say the true thing gently, how to notice the exact moment a person stops pretending. The other 3 days, and most Saturdays, I ran estate auctions. I had come up in the trade beside my father, who cried sales across 5 counties for 40 years, and I had his ear for a room and his eye for a value. It is a strange and specific gift. I could walk through a dead stranger's parlor and tell you, inside a dollar, what the Roseville jardiniere was worth and what the antique secretary desk was really worth, which was often nothing. I could tell those 2 things apart faster than most appraisers could find their reading glasses. People confuse the 2 halves of me, the softness and the sharpness, as if a woman cannot both hold a widower's hand and know to the penny what her own worth is. I could do both. I want that on the record before the rest of it. I had a life outside those 2 vocations, too, small and specific, and mine. On Tuesday evenings, I sang second alto in a community chorus that met in the basement of the Winterset Library, 20-odd women murdering rudder and enjoying it thoroughly. I kept a pair of Americana hens named Dorothy and Ruth, who laid eggs the color of a robin's throat, and I gave the eggs away in cartons to the neighbors because I could never eat them fast enough. My late husband Paul had left me his habit of doing the crossword in ink, and I had kept it up out of loyalty, filling the register's puzzle every morning while the coffee brewed, wrong answers and all, because to erase felt like admitting the day could be undone. These are the details that go on underneath a woman's larger story, and they are the ones that hold you steady later when the larger story tries to knock you down. The first wrong note came in October at Bernadette's own kitchen table in Ankeny. It was so small that I talked myself out of it before I had even finished the drive home. She was 32 then, my Bernadette, sharp as a tack and twice as bright. She had married a man named Grayson, who sold commercial real estate for Fairwind Realty, and wore his ambition the way some men wear cologne, a little too much of it in a small room. We were clearing the supper dishes, the grandchildren already down the hall in their pajamas, and I mentioned, only in passing, that I planned to leave the 2 of them the lake cabin near Okoboji when I was gone. It was the one my father built with his brother in 1961. Bernadette did not say thank you. She said, "How much do you think it's actually worth now, with the lakefront the way it's gone?" There was a hunger in the question that had nothing to do with the cabin and everything to do with something I could not yet name. I told myself she was tired. I told myself 32 was a hard, stretch-thin age, all small children and mortgages, and a husband who measured every dinner party against the last one. Then I got in my car and drove the 40 minutes home with the radio off and a knot under my ribs I pretended was heartburn. Over that winter, the knot did not go away. It only learned to sit quietly. Bernadette began to manage my access to the children the way Grayson managed a listing, with a smile and a schedule and a firm hand on the terms. When I asked to take my granddaughter Wren to the living history farms for her 7th birthday, the way I had taken Bernadette herself at that age, I was told the calendar was full. Then I watched on the internet as the family went without me and posted the pictures. In December, I dropped off a snow globe I had bought Wren at the Amana colonies, a little glass world with a covered bridge inside it, because the child had always loved bridges. Bernadette met me at the door and did not ask me in. The storm door between us was a thing I felt in my teeth. In February, I overheard my grandson Bram tell his mother on the phone, not knowing I was on the line too, that Grandma Delia smelled like the old people's store. I heard Bernadette laugh. She did not correct him. She just laughed, and the laugh was worse than the words. Still, I kept showing up. That is the part I am not ashamed of. I kept baking, kept driving, kept buying snow globes, because you do not stop watering a garden because one spring has been dry. There was a Sunday that March I have never quite put down. I had made a pan of the ham balls my mother used to make, the recipe copied out in her hand on an index card gone soft as cloth, and I drove them over to Ankeny in the good Pyrex dish with the lid taped on. Bernadette met me on the driveway before I reached the steps. She took the dish out of my hands like a woman accepting a package from a stranger, thanked me in the voice you use on a solicitor, and told me the children were napping, which, at 4 p.m, they were not. I could see Wren's face at the front window watching me, and I lifted my hand to wave, and Bernadette stepped sideways to block the line between us. That was the moment I understood it was deliberate. Not a busy season, not a stretched thin marriage, a wall, going up brick by brick, and my own daughter laying the courses. There was one more thing that spring, and it was the thing that told me Grayson's hand was on the wheel. Bernadette called me on a Tuesday, which she never did, and asked with elaborate casualness whether I still had my father's old sale records, the ledgers from all those auctions, and whether the cabin's deed and survey were somewhere safe. I said they were. She said Grayson only wanted to help me get organized, that a woman my age shouldn't have important papers floating around loose. I was 51 and singing Rudder on Tuesdays and running 6-figure estate sales, and my daughter was calling to suggest I could no longer be trusted with a manila folder. I told her the papers were exactly where my father had left them, and I hung up gently, and I sat a while in the quiet of the kitchen with the 2 hens fussing outside the screen door, and I understood that a survey had begun, not of the cabin, of me. By the following autumn, the erosion had a shape to it, and the shape was Grayson's. He had gotten it into his head that my father's cabin and the 11 acres around it were worth a great deal more than I had ever let on, and that I was, in his phrase, sitting on an asset. He said this to me at Thanksgiving, carving the turkey with a knife he had bought specifically for carving turkeys. He said the estate ought to be put on a professional footing while I was still around to sign things. He had a man from Fairwind who could handle the appraisal, and wouldn't that be simpler than leaving it all to chance? I set down my fork. Then I told him, kindly, because I am a hospice worker and I know how to deliver hard news, that I had cried more estate sales than his appraiser had eaten hot dinners. I told him I would decide the disposition of my father's cabin when I was good and dead, and not 1 hour sooner. Bernadette did not defend me. She looked at her plate. And I understood, in that long moment over the cooling turkey, that my daughter had chosen a version of her life in which I was an obstacle to be surveyed and moved. She had married a man who had taught her the vocabulary for it. The offense itself, when it came, did not come at Thanksgiving or over any turkey. It came in April, and it came in a way I could not have invented if I had tried for a year. I had gone 11 weeks without seeing the grandchildren. 11 weeks of unreturned calls and canceled Sundays, and I finally drove to Ankeny unannounced on a Saturday, because a grandmother's patience is long, but it is not infinite. Wren answered the door. She was 8 by then, all elbows and gap teeth, and when she saw me on the step, her face did something I will carry to my grave. It fell open with fear, the way a face does when it sees a ghost. She took one step backward into the hall, and she said in a small voice, "But Mommy said you died." Behind her, little Bram appeared, and he said it too, the way children repeat a thing they have been made to believe. "You went to heaven, Grandma, at Christmas." My daughter had told my grandchildren that I was dead. She had held a small, quiet funeral in their imaginations, buried me at Christmas to keep them from asking after me, so that my absence would look like grief instead of what it was, which was banishment. Bernadette came around the corner from the kitchen and saw me on the step, and she did not deny a word of it. She said only, "You shouldn't have come here." Then she pulled the children back and closed the door, and I stood on the step of my daughter's house, having just learned that I had been dead all winter, and nobody had thought to tell the corpse. I did not fall apart on that step. I want to be precise about this, because grief and collapse are not the same thing, and I know the difference professionally. I drove home. I made a pot of the constant comment tea my mother used to make, the orange and clove smell of it filling the kitchen, and I sat at the table where I had cut that coffee cake into 9 squares a year and a half before. I let the grief move through me the way I have taught 100 families to let it move, without arguing with it. And somewhere in the second cup, the grief did something I had not expected. It did not soften into resignation, the way it does in the widowers I sit with. It hardened into something clear and load-bearing, like water turning to ice inside a crack and splitting the stone. My daughter had decided I was worth more to her dead than alive, worth more as a story than a person. And I understood, with a terrible calm, that I was going to have to prove her wrong. Not for spite, because a woman who lets herself be buried alive teaches her granddaughter that grandmothers are disposable, and I would not teach Wren that, whatever it cost. The next Monday I called Sandra Wenzel. She had been my attorney and my friend since we were both young mothers in a church nursery in 1998, and she talks the way she does everything, which is fast and without wasted motion. I did not go to her with a scheme. I went to her with a problem, the way you go to a doctor with a pain, and I told her the whole of it, the 11 weeks and the closed door and the words out of my grandchildren's mouths. Sandra listened all the way through, which is rare in a lawyer. Then she was quiet for a moment, and she said, "Delia, they can keep you from the kids for now, and I hate it, but that's not actually the fight they've picked. Listen to what you just told me. This isn't about seeing the babies. Grayson's been circling your father's cabin for 2 years. This is about the money." And she was right, and the rightness of it settled the last of the grief into something I could use. What Grayson wanted was the asset. What Bernadette wanted, God help her, was to be married to a man who got what he wanted. The cruelty toward the children was only the crowbar they were using to pry me loose from a place I would not be pried from while I lived. Here is where being who I am stopped being a private comfort and started being a spine. In the weeks after, I learned through a cousin still on speaking terms with them that Grayson had gone ahead and had my father's cabin appraised by his man at Fairwind. He had done it quietly, without my leave, as though the place were already spoken for. The number his man had put on it was $290,000. It was an inflated figure, built on comparable lakefront sales that had nothing to do with a 1961 cabin with knob and tube wiring and a septic field that predated the Nixon administration. He was telling people, I learned, that his mother-in-law was in decline and not managing her affairs, and that the family would soon need to step in. That is the sort of thing a man says when he is preparing the ground for a guardianship. I had cried enough estate sales to know exactly what he was doing. He was building a paper story in which I was fading, so that when the day came, the cabin would fall to them like fruit off a shaken tree. And the beautiful, ordinary thing, the thing that no hidden weapon could ever match, was that I knew what that cabin was actually worth. Knowing what things are worth is the whole of my trade. So I did the plainest thing a person in my position can do. I hired the real thing. I brought in a certified appraiser out of the Auctioneers Association I had belonged to for 30 years, a meticulous woman named Priya Anand, who did not know me from Adam and had no stake in the answer. She appraised the cabin and the 11 acres properly, on the record. She photographed the wiring and the septic and the failing dock and the floodplain easement along the south line, the one Grayson's man had somehow neglected to mention. The honest number came back at $141,000, less than half of what Fairwind had conjured. I had Sandra file it, along with a full accounting of my own capacity, my job, my finances, my clean bill of mental health from my own physician. So there it sat in the county record, in black and white, a true document that made a liar out of every whisper Grayson had planted. I did not fire it off at anyone. I did not send it in triumph. I set it down where it belonged, the way you lay a true weight on a scale, and I let it sit there. Then I went back to my life and waited. I have learned in my work that the truth does not need to shout. It only needs to be present when the shouting stops. The wedding was in June, out at a restored barn on an acreage northwest of Des Moines, past the last of the subdivisions where the corn takes over again. Grayson's younger sister Ingrid was marrying a decent-seeming orthodontist, and the whole extended clan had been folded in. Because I was still, in the eyes of the law and Ingrid's own kindness, the grandmother of the flower girl and the ring bearer, I received an invitation. I suspect Grayson never imagined I would use it. I used it. I put on the good navy dress and my mother's garnet earrings, and I drove out past the last of the streetlights as the sun went down. I walked into that barn among 200 people, half of whom thought I was dead, and I took a seat near the back, and I did nothing at all. That is the part I am proudest of. I did not confront anyone during the vows or the toasts or the first dance. I let the evening be Ingrid's. I let Grayson hold court by the bar in his summer weight suit, telling the orthodontist's people about the lakefront property coming into the family, and I watched him from across the room with the patient attention I usually save for a slow-selling auction, waiting for the lot to come up on its own. It came up near 11, when the older folks had gone home and the barn had loosened into that late, honest hour when people say true things. Grayson's father, a hard old man named Roland who had made his money in grain elevators and did not suffer fools, cornered me near the dessert table. The wedding cake had been reduced to a ruin of buttercream. He said, not unkindly, that he'd heard I'd had some trouble and wasn't managing, and that Grayson had told him the cabin would need to be dealt with soon, for my own good. And I understood that this was the moment. Not because I had planned it, but because the truth had finally walked up and stood next to me at the dessert table. So I told Roland, evenly, that I was a hospice social worker who had held the hands of 400 dying people. I told him I was a licensed auctioneer in my 31st year. And I told him I had my own certified appraisal of that cabin, filed with the county, that put it at $141,000 against the $290 his son's man had invented. The real number, I said, accounted for the flood easement and the failed septic, and any figure above it was not an appraisal, but a wish. Roland had bought and sold more land than his son would ever touch. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked across the barn at Grayson, still holding court by the bar, and something in the old man's face changed, and it was not on my behalf. It was the look of a man recalculating who his son actually was. Grayson must have felt the temperature shift from across the room, the way a con man always does, because he crossed the floor to us with his glass in his hand and his easy smile fixed in place. He asked what we were discussing, jovial, proprietary, a host in a barn that was not his. Roland told him, flatly, that they were discussing the cabin and the appraisal and the number, and asked why his own man's figure was more than double the county's. And I watched my son-in-law's bluster do the only thing bluster can do when the floor is pulled from under it. It got louder first, then thinner, then it ran out entirely. He said something about different methodologies and something about market timing. And then, seeing that his father was not a wedding guest to be charmed, but a grain man who had heard every lie a seller ever told, he simply stopped talking. A coward wears power like a borrowed coat. Take the coat, and there is only the small, cold man who was always underneath it. I had spent a winter being dead, so that man would not have to be inconvenienced. And now I stood at a ruined wedding cake and watched him discover that his father could see straight through the wool. I did not stay to watch it detonate, because it did not detonate. That was never the shape of it. Grayson's undoing was not a single blast, but a long, quiet erosion, the mirror image of what he had done to me. And I got to watch it come apart over the following year from the comfortable distance of my own porch. Roland, it turned out, had been quietly financing the down payment on Grayson and Bernadette's house in Ankeny. He did not care for being made a fool of in front of his new in-laws, and the money that had flowed so freely began to flow the other way, which is to say, it stopped. Fairwind Realty had a quiet reckoning of its own that autumn over some appraisals that had been running high across several deals, and Grayson's name was somewhere in that mess. He left the firm the following spring to pursue other opportunities, which is the phrase men use when the door has been held open for them. The house in Ankeny went up for sale 18 months after that wedding, and Bernadette, my Bernadette, who had buried me alive to keep a man who could not keep himself, learned the specific cost of building a life on a lie about her own mother's worth. The part that saved me, though, was not any of that watching. It was Wren. Ingrid, the bride, had never had a mother of her own worth the name, and she had heard the whole story from Roland by autumn. She was the one who quietly told Wren the truth on a drive back from a soccer game. She told her that her grandmother was not in heaven, that she had never been in heaven, that she was alive in Winterset and had been the whole time. And Wren, who was 9 by then, did the thing children do when a wall comes down. She wrote me a letter in pencil on paper torn from a school notebook, and she mailed it herself. It said, "Dear Grandma Delia, I am glad you are not died. I told Bram, he is glad too." The snow globe with the bridge is on my window still. I keep that letter in the drawer of my father's roll-top desk, next to the snow globe, which Wren gave back to me to keep safe until she was allowed to come. I take it out sometimes and read it and let it do to me what it does. That was my conscience witness, a bride I barely knew who told a child a small, true thing on a car ride. It mattered more than the appraisal ever could. They are back in my life now, the grandchildren, slowly, on a schedule worked out through Sandra and a family therapist. Trust that has been buried does not come up all at once. It comes up the way anything real comes up, one season at a time. Bernadette and I are not repaired. I have made a kind of peace with the possibility that we never will be, that some daughters marry the wrong story and cannot find their way back out of it, and that a mother can grieve a living child. But Wren comes to the cabin now, out on the 11 acres that were never worth what a liar said they were worth. She stands on the old dock her great-grandfather built in 1961, and she asks me the value of things, the way I once asked my father. She holds up a mussel shell, a smooth stone, a rusted lure some fisherman lost in 1970, and she says, "How much, Grandma?" And I tell her the truth about each one, the honest, small worth of it, because that is the only inheritance that has ever held its price. Last August, she asked me the value of the cabin itself, having heard the grown-ups murmur figures, and I told her a house is worth exactly what it keeps safe. She thought about that for a while, the way she thinks about everything, and then she said the cabin was worth me. I have been given a great many compliments in 53 years and appraised a great many treasures, and I have never heard a truer number in my life. I have cut a great many coffee cakes since that whole one cooled by the east window, and I have learned to cut them for whoever actually comes. Here is what I know now at 53 that I did not know at 51. Your worth is not a number somebody else assigns you when they think you are not looking. It is not a thing they can bury just because it would be more convenient to grieve you than to face you. It is the honest weight of the thing itself, sitting on the scale in plain daylight, waiting only to be read by someone with the eyes to read it true. I had those eyes the whole time. It only took me until sunrise to remember they were mine.